Don't sit here, Chloe. You're not wanted at this table. I watched Daniel's lips move, forming the words that shattered the illusion of a perfect day. He didn't shout. That was the worst part. He leaned in, his voice dangerously soft. But everyone at the head table, my sister, the maid of honor, his best man, and our parents, heard him clearly. The music, a schmaltzy rendition of Perfect, suddenly felt like a cruel joke echoing across the magnificent ballroom floor, holding the train of my ivory bridesmaid dress, feeling a cold heat bloom across my chest. My smile, which I'd meticulously practiced all day, faltered and then froze. This was the moment I realized my sister, Olivia, was attempting the impossible. She tried to pretend everything was fine, but looking around the room, at the sudden sharp silence that had swallowed the laughter, a graphic designer
Everyone
from
knew
Atlanta,
something terrible
and I had
just
flown
happened.
halfway across
My
the
name
country,
is Chloe.
spending a ridiculous amount of money on custom-made shoes to celebrate the wedding of my only sibling. If you had asked me 3 months ago what Daniel was, I would have answered, a handsome, ambitious idiot who makes my sister happy. Today, standing 2 feet from him while he casually assassinated my character in front of
whirlwind
200
romance,
guests, the kind that looks great on Instagram, but Olivia and Daniel had close. He was a VP at some financial firm, all crisp shirts, smooth hair, and an unnerving confidence. When they first announced their engagement 6 months prior, my mother cried tears of joy. My father, always more reserved, merely raised an eyebrow. I was the only one who consistently felt that prickle of wrongness whenever Daniel was around. The way was never he'd anything subtly concrete. correct Olivia's stories in Just public. small. The way he'd always steer the conversation back to his accomplishments, or how he insisted on managing every single detail of the wedding, down to the shade of the napkins. It's his day too, Chloe, Olivia had chastised me a month ago when I questioned why Daniel was vetoing her choice of flowers. He just likes control. It's how he is. Control is one thing, I hated being the cynical ownership sister is another. So I retreated, focusing on my duties. The seating chart, however, became the biggest point of contention. Traditionally, the immediate family sits at the head table, or a close adjacent one. I was the maid of honor. Of course, I was supposed to be there. 2 weeks before the wedding, Daniel emailed me the final seating diagram. My name was missing from the inner circle. The kitchen access, as we need the liberty of placing you at table strictly for business associates and key investors. His email read, "Family is important, but this is a networking opportunity, Chloe. You understand?" I didn't understand. I called Olivia, furious. "He said what?" She whispered over the phone, sounding tired. "Oh, sweetie, I know. I fought him on it. Table 17 for me. But he's right. I reluctantly agreed. His boss is coming from New York. It's crucial for his promotion. Please, I told myself it was just Daniel being a jerk, prioritizing profit over kin. But when I arrived at the reception hall just minutes before the guests, I snuck a peek at table 17. It was situated right next to the swinging kitchen doors, where the waiters stacked dirty dishes. My place card was there, next to a distant cousin I hadn't seen since I was 10. I held my tongue as the ceremony ended and the reception with a manufactured smile. I sat through the toasts, which felt less like celebrations of love and more like declarations of Daniel's future wealth. When the photographer finally called for the official family portraits at the head table, the one I wasn't supposed to sit at, I walked over, expecting to stand behind my parents. But Daniel, ever the conductor of the social dinner service, began, ushered everyone to their seats. My mother patted the chair between her and Olivia. "Come on, Chloe, sit quickly. We need you in this one." I hesitated, glancing at Daniel. He was busy adjusting his tie, oblivious. I quickly slid into the chair. I deserved this spot. I was her sister. That's when he turned around. His eyes landed on me, and the veneer of the charming groom evaporated. The air left my lungs as his gaze locked onto mine. He simply walked over, cold and stopped sharp beside me, and uttered those 6 soft, devastating words. "Don't sit here, Chloe. You're not wanted at this table." I felt the blood drain from my face. My sister finally stopped pretending. Her eyes widened, horrified, but she remained silent, paralyzed by her husband's cruelty. Daniel, meanwhile, pointed toward the back of the room. "Your table is 17, ready to sink into the floor and disappear forever." Physical weight. I knew Daniel was trying to stand up, and everyone else who held the power now. He was isolating Olivia, starting by cutting off her support system. But just as my knees buckled and the first tear threatened to fall, a sound cut through the oppressive silence, the scrape of a chair being pushed back violently. It was Grandpa Frank. He was 84, gatherings, a retired preferring to watch and the chaos quiet as a stone at family. He wasn't at the head table. He was at the adjacent family table, table 2. Grandpa Frank stood up slowly. He wasn't a tall man, but in that moment, he seemed to dominate the entire ballroom. He didn't look at Daniel. He looked straight at me, his eyes full of a familiar, righteous fury. "You're right, Daniel." Grandpa Frank's voice boomed steady and loud, cutting through the music that had timidly resumed. "I knew it. Even Grandpa was siding with the groom." He took 2 deliberate steps toward the head table, reached into his suit pocket, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Then he looked Daniel directly in the eye for the first time. "She doesn't belong at this table because I just purchased the entire catering company, the hotel chain that owns this venue, and the controlling interest in Daniel's financial firm," unfolding the paper, which looked suspiciously like a crumpled napkin, and placing it squarely on Daniel's untouched plate. "And my first order of business as the new owner is to terminate the contract of anyone who makes a member of my family cry on their sister's wedding day." A gasp ripped through the crowd, louder than any music. Daniel's jaw dropped. The smooth, it was a printed confirmation of a massive wire transfer. "Chloe the piece of family. Paper wasn't," Grandpa Frank continued, his voice softer now, but infinitely more lethal. "And family sits wherever they damn well please. You, however, are now unemployed, Daniel. And as I recall, the prenup Olivia signed specified that in the event of job loss or gross moral turpitude within the first year, she gets to keep the house in Scottsdale." A tear tracing a path Olivia through her expertly applied makeup. She didn't look at Daniel. She stood, walked around the table, and pulled me into a hug that felt like an apology for the last 6 months. The entire ballroom, filled with Daniel's key investors, was silent, witnessing the total collapse of his calculated future. Daniel stammered, his face going from pale to an alarming shade of purple. Grandpa Frank just chuckled. "This is dry, crazy. Rusty sound. You spent billions just because she sat in the wrong seat. Because you showed me exactly who you are. And trust me, I always protect my investment, especially my granddaughters." The wedding ended there. Olivia filed the annulment paperwork 2 days later. She had known about Daniel's cruel streak, but like many victims of emotional control, she needed a seismic event, a public declaration of his ownership to finally break free. Sometimes they are quietly the greatest lesson I learned, and the determined scrape of an 84-year-old man's chair. If you've ever felt that subtle, terrifying feeling that something isn't right in your own life, don't ignore it for the sake of appearances. Trust the prickle. Trust your gut. And if you have a Grandpa Frank, hold him close. The silence that followed Grandpa Frank's defiant scrape of the chair didn't. It was the kind of temporary truce granted by shock, not resolution. I remember driving home to Naperville that night, the streetlights blurring into streaks of yellow worry, feeling a cold, crystalline certainty settle in my stomach. Frank was safe for now, but the battle wasn't over. Something sinister had been hovering around him for months, and I had been too busy, too arrogant in my assumption of normalcy is that it feels to see it like until that explosive public moment otherwise. For the next 2 weeks, I felt like I was living under a spotlight, constantly scanning the periphery. I started noticing things that, individually, meant nothing, but stacked up like loose bricks suggested a looming structure of malice. The first sign was the coffee. Grandpa Frank has drunk the same exact brand, Dunkin' Midnight Blend. The canister on his counter every morning was a generic store brand, clearly swapped out. But twice that week, when I asked him, he just squinted. "Must be losing it, Alex." thought I bought the good stuff. But Frank doesn't lose it about coffee. That was his ritual, his anchor. Then there was the mail. Frank always sorted his own correspondence, meticulous about bills and junk mail. But I found a stack of envelopes, bank statements, clearly opened and hastily shredded immediately, tucked under the throw pillows in his sunroom. He looked genuinely confused, touching the jagged edges of the envelopes like they were alien artifacts. Victor must have grabbed them. He sometimes helps me with the shredding. Victor. The name hung in the air like dust after a demolition. Victor Vance was Frank's trusted financial advisor. Victor had insinuated himself into Frank's life about a year ago, right after Grandma Helen passed. He was charming, attentive, and sickeningly professional. And he was the man who had been at the center of that public declaration, the man whose face had gone white with thwarted rage when Frank made his move. I realized I couldn't rely on Frank's memory anymore. Whether it was genuine age-related forgetfulness or something else, Victor was doing more than just helping. I needed to see the paperwork he was supposedly managing. My investigation started small, focusing on the only trail I could follow without breaking laws: digital breadcrumbs. I logged into Frank's secondary email, the one he rarely used, claiming I needed to help him update his password. What I found was a series of encrypted calendar invitations, all originating from Victor's corporate account, about Frank. They weren't appointments for Frank, dated 3 months prior, simply read 3 p.m., Title Co., finalizing POA transfer. POA, power of attorney. The blood went cold in my veins. This wasn't just about shuffling stocks. This was about control. If Victor had full power of attorney, he could liquidate Frank's assets, sell his house, and make medical decisions. Frank would essentially become a ward that he had only given Victor limited financial oversight and signed the checks. Limited. I spent the next 48 hours in a haze of caffeine and creeping dread. I knew Victor kept his personal files in a separate annex office attached to his sprawling suburban home in Winnetka. The office was supposed to be impenetrable, key card access, 2-factor authentication on his computer list. But I remembered something Frank had behind a bookshelf where he stored legacy documents for his wealthiest clients. I needed to see what was in that safe. I called Victor, fabricating a crisis about a missing tax document. He was annoyingly sympathetic, assuring me he'd be out of the office until late the following evening, attending a charity gala downtown. The window was narrow. 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. I parked 3 blocks away. The air in Winnetka was thick with the scent of manicured wealth, and approached the back entrance of Victor's annex. I was wearing dark clothes, surgical gloves I'd lifted from a dentist friend, and carrying a small, heavy bag containing exactly what I needed: a basic lock-picking kit and a digital camera. The lock on the annex door was surprisingly simple: a cheap bolt lock and a standard deadbolt. Audacity of his clearly relied on the neighborhood security patrol, and 5 minutes later, the deadbolt clicked. Inside, the office smelled of expensive leather and stale ambition. I moved fast, my flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. I located the custom bookshelf, heavy cherry wood, exactly where Frank had described. Finding the mechanism to slide it open took 15 frantic minutes. It was cleverly disguised as a non-functional light switch plate. Digital. The safe was revealed. Thank God. A large... I didn't have the combination, but I had brought a stethoscope and the patience of a stalker. I pressed my earphone against the cool metal, turning the dial slowly, listening for the faint, crucial clicks. Tick, pause, thunk. Tick, pause. Thunk. The concentration required was suffocating. The safe wasn't packed with cash sounded like a shout, but with file After what felt like an eternity, the true currency the handle turned with a heavy, I pulled out the folder labeled Vance F. Inside, the top document wasn't a standard investment portfolio. It was a formal deed. My eyes burned, scanning the bold typeface. Deed of transfer executed by Florence J. Vance, trustee, to Victor R. Vance, owner, Florence J. Vance, My grandma
Document
Helen.
was even worse. Power
I
of
flipped a
attorney,
page, signed
my
by
hand
Frank,
shaking so
dated
badly I
6
almost
weeks
dropped the
after
entire
Helen's
file.
death. But the signature,
second,
it was shaky, almost illegible. Frank's signature was precise, even at 84. This was a crude imitation. And then I found the third document, the smoking gun that explained everything. A trust amendment created just 2 years ago when Helen was already battling the cancer that would eventually
deemed
take her.
mentally incapacitated.
The amendment specified
100%
that upon
of the
Frank's
estate,
death,
or
including the
if.
family farm and all liquid assets, would pass not to me, his only grandchild, but to the executor of the trust, named explicitly as Victor Vance, provided that Victor could produce a validly executed power of attorney during Frank's lifetime. Victor hadn't just been managing Frank's money, he had manipulated Helen into
Victor
setting
could
up the
swoop
ultimate
in,
contingency
declare him
plan,
unfit,
ensuring
claim
that if
everything.
Frank ever became
The public
weak, declaration Frank had made weeks ago, the one about ownership, wasn't about a minor financial maneuver. It was his final, desperate attempt to reclaim his life. Before Victor could finalize the declaration of incapacitation, I quickly photographed every page, the cold certainty in my gut solidifying into a burning rage. Family
Victor
legacy,
didn't just want the
piece
money.
by
He
fabricated
wanted to
peace.
erase Frank's dignity
I closed
and
the
steal
safe,
my...
slid the bookshelf back into place, and walked out into the cold night air, the heavy folder burning a hole in my mind. I hadn't just found proof. I had found the blueprint for Frank's complete and utter destruction. There was no time to call the police yet. If I acted too soon, Victor could destroy the digital evidence. I knew what I had to do. I had to confront
and
Victor
use the
with his own
leverage of
documents,
the fraudulent
ensuring
POA
he knew
signature
I
to
had
force
his hand. It was risky, stupid even, but if I went through official channels, Frank would be subjected to endless court battles, mental evaluations, and public scrutiny. Exactly what Victor wanted to facilitate his takeover. I looked at the photos on my camera screen, the clear image of the forged signature staring back at me.
And for every quiet,
This
decent
wasn't
person
just my fight
whoever
anymore.
trusted the wrong
This was for
smiling
Grandpa
face.
Frank.
If you find
For
yourself in
Grandma
the same
Helen,
situation,
don't just trust your gut. Arm yourself with evidence, because the person who is trying to own you will always leave a paper trail, and sometimes you have to be the one brave enough to follow it into the dark. And if you're wondering what happened next, how I managed to use those photos to beat Victor
lived out
Vance
his
at his
final
own
years
game,
in peace and
ensuring that
dignity.
my grandpa
Well, that's
Frank,
a story
for another time. But let me tell you, it involved a very public lawyer, a very private recording, and the determined scrape of a certain 84-year-old man's chair, this time scraping away the last vestiges of Victor's control forever. Click that like button and subscribe if you want to know exactly how I took down the slickest shark in Winnetka without ever stepping foot in a courtroom.
Response wasn't a roar,
Victor's,
but a pathetic, strangled cough. The moment the recording, that quiet, unassuming audio clip detailing his carefully worded threats and the chilling calmness with which he planned to bleed my grandfather dry, hit the desk of the State Bar Ethics Committee, the air pressure in Winnetka dropped. He didn't fight back, not really. He knew the game was over. The recording wasn't just damning, it was proof that his entire
Production
professional
designed
facade
for the
was
sole
a theatrical
purpose of preying on the weak. The lawyer I hired, a sharp-toothed woman named Ilara, who specialized in administrative evisceration, ensured that Victor didn't face prison time, but something far worse, for a man whose identity was tied to his bank balance and his corner office view of Lake Michigan. Public, professional disgrace. He lost his license. He lost his partnerships.
was quietly listed.
I never saw
Within
him
a
again
month,
after the initial
the beautiful,
cease and
sterile
desist hearing,
Victorian
and I
house
didn't
on
need
Green
Bay. The silence that followed his departure tasted like fresh, clean rain after a long, oppressive drought. The real victory, the one that mattered more than any settlement or ethical ruling, was the change in Grandpa Frank. When I brought him back to his true home, the little sunroom overlooking the garden in Highland
Leather
Park,
armchair.
the first thing he did was look
the
at his
silent
witness
witness
to his months of anxiety. The source of that terrible telling scrape now sat waiting. He approached it tentatively, like a man meeting an old friend he'd offended. Then, slowly, deliberately, he sat down.
There was no tension in his shoulders, no fear in the way his worn slippers touched the wood floor. He didn't scrape the chair back. I heard a sound that nearly brought me to my knees. Settled. Grandpa Frank was that humming, evening, alone, when I was making him his favorite cup of tea, perfectly contented tune that I hadn't heard since before my grandmother died. A sound Victor's polished boots and predatory questions had chased into silence for months. We spent the next 9 months in a bubble of recovered peace. Frank was 84, and the strain of the previous year had taken its toll. But the dignity he regained together, reading the papers, fuel a final, watching the Chicago Cubs chapter. And sometimes he would drift off in that chair, and I would watch his chest rise and fall, not with the rapid panic I'd learned to dread, but with the steady, measured rhythm of a man finally at rest. He passed away in the early spring, quiet and warm, his hand resting on the arm of his favorite chair. The grief was immense, but it wasn't complicated by regret or anger. Honored the promise I made. I knew, not with just to him, certainty, but to myself, that no shark, no matter how slick or well-dressed, would steal the peace of the innocent on my watch. The whole ordeal changed me too. I learned that the greatest battles aren't fought with fists or shouting matches, but through meticulous, painful preparation and the willingness to look closer at the things others ignore. Victor was predictable in his greed, but mostly he underestimated the power of listening and sheer. How many times do we dismiss the subtle cues in our lives? The momentary hesitation in a loved one's voice, the shadow of fear in their eyes, the nervous tick that says, "I am not safe." We are so conditioned to look for the dramatic explosion that we miss the tiny, persistent warning sounds, the scrape of a chair, the pause before a forced scraping smile against the floorboards. If I hadn't tuned my ear to terror the specific mechanical sound every time Victor's name was mentioned, I might have lost him completely, long before his natural time. The chair was his only way of crying out when he wasn't allowed to speak. The lesson I carry now, the enduring scar of that long, cold winter in Winnetka, is simple. Pay attention to the quiet things. The real monster often works in whispers, on a tile floor, and the most compelling evidence for the headline, look for the footnote. If you've ever felt like you were fighting a battle that seemed impossible, remember the sound of that chair. Remember that the seemingly insignificant details are often the keys that unlock the entire terrible truth. The fight for those who can't fight for themselves is exhausting, but it is the most important fight we have. And if you want the full breakdown of the legal, the specific lawyer, the exact wiretapping laws we skirted, and the moment Victor realized his highly organized life was ruined, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. The story of how we used an obscure piece of Illinois estate law to turn Victor's own meticulously crafted contract into his personal undoing is next week. I promise you, it's even crazier than the chair.